الحمد لله رب العالمين وأفضل الصلاة وأتم التسليم على سيد المرسلين سيدنا ونبينا محمد ذي القدر العظيم وعلى آله وأصحابه وأتباعه إلى يوم الدين. اللهم فقهنا في الدين وعلمنا التأويل وألهمنا رشدنا يا رب العالمين. Alhamdulillah. In our lessons on Maraqi al-Falah, Sharh Nur al-Idah, we've reached the prayer of the sick person. Babu Salatil Marid. And marad, sickness, is one of the awarid al-taklif. It's one of the things that affect moral responsibility. Right? Now the basis, and it affects it with respect to certain rulings of the prayer. Of course, by sickness, the primary thing that sickness affects in the prayer is what? Standing. Right? There are other sicknesses that affect the prayer in different ways. There's sickness that can cause loss of consciousness. There's sickness that can cause loss of sanity. There's sickness that can cause protracted sleep. Right? But the primary discussion with respect to sickness is a subset of the rulings related to the sick person. And then the sick person, right, there's also the broad consideration that slight hardship, the haraj or the mashaqqa, the hardship, the difficulty or the hardship, is yasir وليس سببا للرخص الشرعية. The slight hardship or slight difficulty is not a cause for the shari'i dispensations. And there's haraj shadid, right? The intense hardship or the severe hardship or the considerable hardship is that which is وهو ما يورث الأعذار والرخص, right? وهو المعتبر شرعا, right? والمدفوع. And the hardship that is considerable is the one that serves as an excuse and is generally lifted in the Sharia. Yeah, the qaida fiqhiyya is al-haraju madfu'. Hardship is lifted. Which hardship? The considerable hardship, right? Otherwise, taklif itself, moral responsibility itself, is a hardship. Right? It's a hardship. It'd be much easier, apparently, not to do anything. But in reality, it'd be much more difficult, because one would be missing out on both eternal good and worldly good. Okay, Babu Salatil Marid. Right? He says, قال الإمام الشرنبلالي رحمه الله تعالى في شرحه من إضافة الفعل إلى فاعله. This is an ascription of the action to its doer. Right? The action, which is prayer, and the doer is the sick person. Because there's different types of إضافة. And what is sickness? He says والمرض حالة للبدن خارجة عن المجرى الطبيعي. Sickness is a state of the body that takes it out from its normal state of affairs. Right? It's a descriptive definition. إذا تعذر على المريض كل القيام وهو الحقيقي وهو أي يعني هذا التعذر هو العذر الحقيقي ومثل الحكم ذكره فقال أو تعسر. If the sick person is unable to stand in any way, and this is the actual inability, the real inability. And like the real inability is the effective inability, which he explained by saying أو تعسر, or it proves difficult. Right? أو تعسر كل القيام. Yani that all types of standing are not possible. It's not the complete standing is not possible, but any standing is not possible. Like كل القيام, verse 2, if any standing is not possible, because if you're able to stand but you can only stand by bending slightly, then you stand like that. You can stand by leaning against something, then you must lean. But if all standing is not possible, that is real inability, or it's unduly difficult. Ta'assar, it's unduly difficult. How? What is ta'assur? This is effective inability, where it's unduly difficult. بوجود ألم شديد, by either finding intense pain, which is ما لا يتحمل مثله عادة, the like of which is generally considered unbearable. Right? أو خاف, or one fears. Right? زيادة مرض, and one fears increase in sickness, etc. بأن غلب على ظنه بتجربة سابقة أو إخبار طبيب مسلم حاذق أو ظهور الحال زيادة المرض أو خاف بطئه أي طول المرض به أي بالقيام صلى قاعدا بركوع وسجود. Right? Such that one found an undue pain, or one feared through reasonable surety, through previous relevant experience, or by the trustworthy report of an upright Muslim doctor, طبيب مسلم حاذق عدل, who is trustworthy, who's upright, number one. Number two, عالم بأحكام الشرع, and who is upright. So they have to be by the reporting of a Muslim doctor who is expert in the area they're talking about. And there's two conditions, which are that there are two other conditions. One is that they're upright. لا يؤخذ بقول الفاسق في الديانات, because the non-upright person, their opinion is not taken on religious matters. And عالم بالأحكام الشرع, and who knows the rulings of the Sharia, right, related to this matter. Right? That's second situation, right? أو ظهور الحال. Some people refer to this as العلامة البينة, or the matter is evident. Right? You try to stand up, you fell over. Then you try to stand over, and you bashed your head against the table. Try to stand up, and you fainted for half an hour. Right? Now, what if a non-Muslim doctor tells you, or a Muslim doctor who is either not upright, or not expert, or doesn't know the rulings of the Sharia? Do you ignore their opinion? No. You take it into consideration and you exercise your judgment. Right? Insofar as, is there reasonable fear of what is described here? Right? Of undue pain, prolongation, etc. So it's not that you ignore the opinion of the non-Muslim doctor or the Muslim doctor who doesn't know the related rulings, but you take their judgment in consideration and see, is this state a state where there's reasonable fear of hardship or harm? So you exercise your judgment informed by what they say. أو خاف زيادة المرض, right? Such that one fears through reasonable surety, established through one of these ways, an increase in their sickness. Of course, an increase in the sickness, أو خاف بطئه, or one fears the أي طول المرض, or one fears the lengthening of the sickness. به, أي بالقيام, by standing. Right? صلى قاعدا بركوع وسجود. Then one prays sitting on the ground with bowing and actual prostration. لما روي عن عمران بن حسين رضي الله تعالى عنه أنه قال كان بي بواسير. He said that I had بواسير. What's بواسير? Hemorrhoids. فسألت النبي صلى الله عليه وآله وسلم عن الصلاة, about how to pray. فقال صلي قائما. He said pray standing. فإن لم تستطع فقاعدا. If you cannot, then pray sitting on the ground. فإن لم تستطع فعلى جنب. And if you cannot, then pray on your side. Right? And this hadith related by Imam Bukhari and others. زاد النسائي فإن لم تستطع فمستلقيا. If you, Imam النسفي, in the narration of Imam al-Nasa'i, it's added, and if you cannot, فمستلقيا. فإن لم تستطع فمستلقيا. If you cannot pray on your side, then pray laying on your back. لا يكلف الله نفسا إلا وسعها. For Allah does not say, make a soul responsible for more than it is able. And interestingly, this is reference to an-Nasa'i by a number of hadith masters like Imam al-Zayla'i in Nasb al-Raya. However, and also by Ibn Hajar in the Diraya. But a number of people said that the published copy of Nasa'i doesn't have it. Right? Because the copies of, there are ikhtilaf of nusakh, the variants in the copies of many hadith books, and it's inevitable. Sometimes because some of the people who transcribed the hadith, they transcribed them reliably, but they included, they had hadiths included and not included. Sometimes even the author related the work multiple times, because hadith was transmitted in majalis of imla, of transmission. And sometimes people did not catch every hadith, for example. Right? That's not a problem, right? Not a problem. Right? Okay. So the point being that if one cannot stand, then stage 2 is to pray sitting on the ground. So how, if one prays sitting on the ground, وَإِذَا قَعَدَ وَيَقْعُدْ إِنْ قَعَدَ كَيْفَ شَاءَ عِنْدَ الْعُذْرِ. Right? And one sits, if one needs to pray sitting, as one wishes, meaning as is facilitated. أي كيف يتيسر له بغير ضرر من تربع وغيره في الأصح. Meaning one sits in whichever way is facilitated, whether without harm, of sitting cross-legged or otherwise, according to the more correct opinion. من غير كراهة, and there's no dislike. كما روي عن الإمام, as is related from the Imam, للعذر, because there you have an excuse, right? Right, and this is the stronger of two opinions, right? And in itself, if it's facilitated, it is superior to sit. The closer one can sit to the tashahhud posture, the better. without leaving that being disliked. Right? So sitting in the tashahhud position, if you can, without hardship, is afdal, it's better. But in terms of permissibility, and without dislike, you sit however you can. Okay. وإلا بأن قدر على بعض القيام قام بقدر ما يمكنه. Otherwise, meaning if you are able to stand a little bit, قام بقدر ما يمكنه بلا زيادة مشقة, without undue hardship. ولو بالتحريم, even if it be with the opening tahrim. وقراءة آية, you can remain standing for one verse, but this would be if you can stand without any hardship in going down. You stand to the extent that you can. وإن حصل به ألم شديد, but if this causes undue pain or fear of harm, يقعد ابتداء, then one can sit from the beginning, meaning sit on the ground from the beginning. كما لو عجز وقعد ابتداء, just as if one was incapable of standing, so one sits from the beginning. وهو المذهب الصحيح, and that's a sound madhab. لأن الطاعة بحسب الطاقة, because obedience is to the extent of capacity. Right? Right? And likewise, if you could lean against something, you lean against something, right? To stand. وَإِن تَعَذَّرَ الرُّكُوعُ وَالسُّجُودُ, if one is unable to bow and prostrate, and prostration is وَضْعُ الْجَبْهَ عَلَى الْأَرْضِ, to place the forehead on the ground. وَقَدْرَ عَلَى الْقُعُودِ وَلَوْ مُسْتَنِدًا, but one can sit even if by leaning against something. صَلَّى قَاعِدًا, then one sits, then one prays seated, بِالْإِيمَاء, with head movements. So you stand if able, even if with assistance, even if it be just for the opening or just for the minimum recitation without hardship. And then if you have to sit on the ground, then you do so. If you cannot, then you pray sitting on the ground. If you cannot pray sitting on the ground, then you pray with head movements. And when you pray with head movements, the default is you pray with head movements seated. Right? صلى قاعدا بالإيماء, one prays seated with head movements. للركوع والسجود برأسه, right? For both bow, you pray with head movements for both bowing and prostration, right? Right? ولا يجزئه مضطجعا, and you cannot, and it's not valid to be lying down if you can pray sitting. وجعل إيماءه برأسه للسجود أخفض من إيمائه برأسه للركوع, and one makes one's bending of one's head movement for the prostration deeper than one's head movement for the ruku'. ولو عجز عن السجود وقدر على الركوع يومئ بهما, if one, وكذا, likewise if one is able to prostrate, one is unable to prostrate but able to make full ruku', then one prays both with head movements. لأن النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم عاد مريضا فرآه يصلي على وسادة فأخذها فرمى بها. Because the Prophet ﷺ saw a person praying, saw a sick person praying. So the Prophet ﷺ visited a sick person and saw him praying on a pillow. So he took it and cast it aside. Right? فأخذ عودا ليصلي عليه. So the man took a stick to pray against. Right? So he could put something against his forehead. Right? فرمى به. So the Prophet ﷺ cast it aside. وقال صلي على الأرض إن استطعت. The Prophet ﷺ said, pray on the ground if you're able. وإلا فأومئ إيماءً. Otherwise, pray with head movements. وَاجْعَلْ سُجُودَكَ أَخْفَضَ مِنْ رُكُوعِكَ. And make your bowing deeper than your prostration. That's the criterion. And make your bowing deeper than your prostration. That is the base criterion. So it's of the makruh actions of the prayer to raise a pillow to one's head to prostrate against. There are two opinions in the madhab of what that means. One is that you, for example, hold a pillow to prostrate against. The other is you put a pillow on the ground that you put your head against. Ibn Abidin prefers that the dislike refers to raising a pillow against your forehead. Right? But if just keeping it on the ground, right? If you have a thin pillow, because you could have flat pillow, you could prostrate against it on the ground to begin with anyways. Right? So karaha would be, imagine if this were a pillow, right? If I'm praying with head movements, the karaha would be I raise it and place my head against it. But if it's on the ground and I prostrate against, let's say the pillow was this high, and I prostrate against it, there's nothing wrong with it. But there would be a degree of impropriety that when the lawgiver has given you ease, then why embrace hardship? Right? If the lawgiver has given you ease, why embrace hardship? Okay. فإن لم يخفضه أي الإيماء للسجود عنه أي عن الإيماء للركوع بأن جعلهما على حد سواء لا تصح أي لا تصح صلاته. If one does not lower one's prostration, one does not make one's head movement with the prostration deeper than one's head movement, one's bowing of the head for the bowing for the ruku', such that one made them level, or worse, one made the head movement for the ruku' less than the head movement for the sujood. Made one's head movement for the sujood less than one's head movement for the ruku', لا تصح, then it's not valid. i.e. لا تصح صلاته, one's prayer is not valid. لفقد السجود حقيقة وحكما مع القدرة, because then you did not prostrate neither actually, which is placing forehead on the ground, and not effectively, which is to make a head movement deeper than the bowing head movement. Right? The sujudul hukmi, the effective prostration, which is when you're praying with head movements with ima, is for the head movement, the bending of the head, for the prostration to be deeper than the bending of the head for the bowing. Okay. ولا يرفع بالبناء للمجهول لوجهه شيء. And nothing should be raised to one's face كحجر وخشبة, such as a stone or a piece of wood, يسجد عليها, that one prostrates against, لما قدمناه, because of what we have mentioned previously. ولقوله صلى الله عليه وسلم من استطاع منكم أن يسجد فليسجد ومن لم يستطع فلا يرفع إلى وجهه شيئا يسجد عليه. Because the words of the Prophet ﷺ related by Imam al-Tabarani and others, including al-Bazzar, and that whoever of you is able to prostrate, meaning place forehead on the ground, then do so, and whoever of you is not able to, then do not raise anything to your face that you prostrate against. وَلْيَكُنْ فِي رُكُوعِهِ وَسُجُودِهِ يُومِئ بِرَأْسِهِ. And let them, in both bowing and prostration, simply bend their head. Right? So that is the وَقَالَ. Now, the basic, the ima is simply طَأْطَأَةُ الرَّأْس. It's bending the head. لا يشترط انحناء الظهر. Bending the back is not a condition. قال في المجتبى. Right? In the mujtaba, which is of the shuruh of Quduri, قال في المجتبى كانت كيفية الإيماء بالركوع والسجود مشتبهة. كانت كيفية الإيماء مشتبهة عليه في أنه يكفي بعض الانحناء أم أقصى ما يمكن. فظفرت على الرواية فإنه ذكر شيخ الإسلام رحمه الله المومئ إذا خفض رأسه للركوع شيئا ثم للسجود شيئا جاز. So the author of the Mujtaba said that he was unsure about how one bends one's head for the ruku'. That is, even the slightest bending of the head sufficient, or one has to bend as much as one can. So he didn't know. He didn't know why, because the basis of the madhab is transmission. So then I found a narration. Because Shaykh al-Islam said, and that the one praying with head movements, if they bend their head slightly for bowing, and then they bend their head slightly more for the prostration, it is valid. Right? Right? Shay'an meaning a little. Right? So a little bowing is sufficient. وفي شرح المقدسي, right? And in the commentary, and this is the commentary on نظم الكنز. الرمز في شرح نظم الكنز. Right? Ibn Ghanim al-Maqdisi. مريض عجز عن الإيماء فحرك رأسه. عن أبي حنيفة يجوز، وقال ابن الفضل لا يجوز لأنه لم يوجد منه الفعل. انتهى. فحقيقة الإيماء طأطأة الرأس. انتهت عبارته. So Ibn Ghanim al-Maqdisi said in his commentary on Nazm al-Kanz that a sick person unable to pray with ima, because ima can refer to moving the head, because awma, it's a bend. It can be with the head, but the language is wider. It could also be bending the back. So here, a sick person unable to make a full bending, meaning with their back as well, فَحَرَّكَ رَأْسَهُ. So they moved their head, meaning that حَرَّكَ رَأْسَهُ دُونَ ظَهْرِهِ. So they moved just their head, meaning without moving their back. عن أبي حنيفة يجوز. It's related from Abu Hanifa. That is valid. وقال ابن الفضل. Muhammad ibn al-Fadl, one of the early Hanafis, said it's not valid because he did not do the action. انتهى. But the position, the narration that's taken is the position mentioned before from Al-Mujtaba, quoting from Shaykh al-Islam Khwahirzada. Of course, Khwahirzada also has a commentary on Quduri, wa Sharh Mushkilat al-Quduri. It's published now. So, in summary, basic, and there's some discussion about this, right? The ishkal is that the ruku' is inhina al-dhahr, right? In the language. So there's discussion about this. Even Ibn Abdin vacillated on this issue between his hashiyah on the Kanz and his hashiyah on Radd al-Muhtar, right? So the position taken by Maulana Ash-Shurunbulali and many others is that basic, just bending of the head is what's needed for both ruku' and sujood. But in Hashid ibn Abdin, he says its reality is mujarradu ta'ta'ati ar-ras. It's merely moving the head. And there's discussion about it. Even Maulana al-Tahtawi has something to say here. Tahtawi likes the narration of Muhammad al-Fadl, correct? Anyone prepare? Yeah. But that claim is a bit difficult to accept because the author of the Mujtaba is, of the early madhab. The author of the Mujtaba, like Shaykh al-Islam Khwahirzada, are of those who have vast surveying of the madhab. And then Shurunbulali and others are well versed in the madhab. So, and the answer legally to the position that, because yes, Aslul ruku' is, the basis of ruku' is bending the back, correct? But then the basis of prostration is forehead on the ground, correct? So when you're praying, فَأَوْمِئْ إِمَاءً, pray with head movements. When you pray with head movements for the deeper bending, which is for prostration, then a fortiori you pray with head movements for the lesser bending, which is ruku'. Because we've left the khas command, which is bow and prostrate. We've left the command of the khas, which the prostration, which is known in the language, by the clear command of the Prophet ﷺ through multiple narrations, and also because of the reality that there's no hardship for you in religion, right? Al-haraj madfu'. Therefore, so that's why the stronger position in the madhab is what's mentioned in Shurunbulali. Head movements is sufficient. So wants to be cautious, then they would bend their back a little bit as well. That would be better. That would be better. But is it required? No. Tahtawi is saying that Ibn al-Fadl's opinion is the mashhur in the madhab. That's mahal nazar, because of the reasons we already mentioned. Allahu subhanahu wa ta'ala a'lam. And وقال أبو بكر. Who's Abu Bakr? Who said it's Jassas? Hmm? Hmm? Okay. وقال أبو بكر رضي الله تعالى عنه. Does he give source for it being al-Jassas?
He just says it's and he says his file came before.
Okay, that doesn't prove anything. Right? Because Abu Bakr is one of the most common names. It's not a default that it be al-Jassas, right? Right? So that قال أبو بكر إذا كان is it mentioned in the Imdad? Who is? Just bring the Imdad with you. It's mentioned by Abu Bakr, but don't believe any editor, right? Unless like they're part of some really strong editorial staff. Even then, don't believe any editorial staff unless they're proven, because it's a claim. If you can give من ادعى شيئا فعليه بالدليل. Now someone proves themselves to be consistently correct, then you say, okay, الظاهر إنه كذلك. But unless you've referenced it to a text and we trust you're quoting from it, Okay, so قال أبو بكر إذا كان بجبهته هو أن, but the reason being, the point being, don't believe footnotes unless you double check. Don't believe authorities in the madhab when they quote. Don't believe them, but double check, because you can get all kinds of. It's not the ulama of biographies don't generally assume that if Abu Bakr is mentioned, because there are some things that are defaults in the madhab. If you say al-Faqih Abu Ja'far, who's meant? Al-Hunduwani. If you say Imam al-Huda, it means so and so. There's different expressions. If you say Fakhrul Islam, there's many people called Fakhrul Islam, but they are assumptions. But Abu Bakr does not necessarily refer to al-Jassas. Unless there's confirmatory proof. إذا كان بجبهته وأنفه عذر يصلي بالإمام. If someone has an excuse with their forehead and with their nose, one prays with head movements. Right? Because you could prostrate just on your nose if you have an excuse with your forehead. You can't do both. You don't just bend, you don't pray as normal and just suspend your head above the ground. Why? Because al-maqadir la tunsab, the limits of the Sharia, that what is a like that in the Arabic language is not considered. The limits are placed by the lawgiver. The lawgiver is commanded sujood, and sujood is to place the forehead and the nose. And the basic thing, if you look in the commentaries on Manzumat al-Khilaf, Abu Hanifa considered the forehead and nose to be one part of the face on the ground. ولا يلزمه تقريب الجبهة إلى الأرض بأقصى ما يمكنه. And it's not required to bring your forehead close to the ground as much as you can. It says وهذا نص في الباب, and this is a clear text regarding this, كما في معراج الدراية, which is on the commentaries on the Hidayah. And one of the tricky expressions in the madhab is sometimes Mi'raj al-Diraya is referred to as Mi'raj, and sometimes it's referred to as Ad-Diraya. But Ad-Diraya, there's a separate commentary also called Ad-Diraya. And Ibn Hajar's takhrij of the hadiths of the Hidayah is Ad-Diraya fi takhrij ahadith al-Hidayah. Right? So, one just needs to know how to navigate around the books, right? And don't make great assumptions about any editors, even if they're ulama don't have ill thought of them. They're just doing the best they can with extraordinarily limited resources. Okay. فإن فعل أي وضع شيئا فسجد عليه وخفض رأسه للسجود عن إيمائه للركوع صحت صلاته لوجود الإيماء، لكن مع الإساءة لما روينا أو روينا وقيل هو سجود كذا في الغاية. And if one does so, i.e. one places something and prostrates on it, but yet keeps one's bending of the head for prostration deeper than one's bending of one's head for the bowing, it is valid. Meaning the prayer is valid because one did pray with head movements, however, with isa'a, with blameworthiness. Right? And others said that it is with karahat tahrim. Right? So the expression here is a little expansive. Right? Imam Tahtawi mentions explicitly that the karaha here is, what does he say? It is of tahrim. Right? That it's prohibitively disliked. Right? It's prohibitively disliked to do this, right? To raise something. So there's two separate things. Placing something on the ground to prostrate on, it's not prohibitively disliked. To raise something to oneself is prohibitively disliked, right? And you can see the discussion in Ibn Abdin. كذا في الغاية, the غاية is also of the commentaries on the Hidayah. Okay. Right? It's also the commentaries on the Hidayah. Then he says, Rahimahullah, ويفعل المريض في صلاته من القراءة والتسبيح والتشهد ما يفعله الصحيح. The one who is sick does in their prayer all that the healthy person does of recitation and tasbih and tashahhud, as the healthy person does. وإن عجز عن ذلك تركه, and anything they're incapable of doing, they leave. كما في التتارخانية, one of the great books of Hanafi, of fatwa in the Hanafi school. And it's respected as a book of fatwa. عن التجريد, quoting the tajreed. What is the tajreed? What is the tajreed? It's a large work by Imam al-Quduri, which is published in about 10 volumes. It's very unique because it goes through the khilaf between us, within our madhab, and the khilaf with Imam al-Shafi'i, and brings the evidences. It's one of the real brilliant works in the madhab, but due to its considerable length, and because it's not focused primarily on legal details, but on legal reasoning, etc. But it's of the pre-Hidayah works that is worthy of consideration, right? It's also very insightful with respect to what Imam al-Shrumbulali, Imam al-Quduri himself chose in Quduri, right? Because Zahir al-Riwayah was not fully set. And so sometimes people they just quickly dismiss what's in Quduri, right? That's wrong, incorrect. Who are you talking about? It's a bit, and you get an appreciation for sometimes you say, Imam al-Quduri was not just the author of the Mukhtasar, right? He's also the Tajreed as well, right? And even like al-Khatib, who was a partisan Shafi'i, praises al-Quduri deeply. Just, they say, وَالْفَضْلُ مَا شَهِدَ بِهِ الْأَعْدَاءُ. Virtue is what enemies bear witness to. Right? They were not, well, I don't know how you could describe it. Khatib. Anyways. Rahmatullahi alayhim ajma'in. So anything of this, the recitation is difficult, even the recitation is lifted, right? Right. Right? And the author of the Fatawa Tatarkhaniya, right? Died in the year 777. Right? And it was named after the head of the Tatars. It's ironic because they destroyed so much of the Muslim world, but then they became Muslim. Right? Of the many marauding peoples who caused much devastation, and then later their descendants became Muslim. And the key was patience. Right? The key was patience and law. So, okay, you want to rule, okay, but let us. You want to have political rule, okay, but let's run the country according to Islamic laws. So they kind of did a strategic concession. Right? The ulama focused on that the education was in the hands of the ulama, and the qada was in the hands of the madaris, and the mahakim were in the hands of the ulama. Ultimately, everyone found it convenient to just be Muslim. It is much more convenient than being rejected by the whole populace, because Muslims don't particularly like leaving their deen. Anyways, that's history. وإلا أي وإن لم يخفض رأسه للسجود أنزل عن الركوع بأن جعلهما سواء لا تصح صلاته لترك فرض الإيماء للسجود كما لو فعل ذلك من غير رفع شيء كما تقدم بيانه. And otherwise, if one does not make the bending of one's head for prostration deeper than one's bowing, such that one made them equal, then one's prayer is not valid because one left the obligation of bending one's head for bowing. Just as if one did that without raising anything whatsoever, as we have previously explained. وَتَعَسَّرَ الْقُعُودِ. If you cannot sit, فَلَمْ يَقْدِرْ عَلَيْهِ مُتَّكِئًا, such that one cannot do so reclining. وَلَا مُسْتَنِدًا إِلَى حَائِطٍ, nor leaning against a wall. أَوْ غَيْرِهِ, or other than a wall. بِلَا ضَرَرٍ, without harm, بِلَا ضَرَرٍ, without harm or hardship. أو حرج. Right? And of course, inability is بِقُدْرَةِ نَفْسِهِ, with their own ability. Right? With their own ability. Right? According to Imam Abu Hanifa. Because what's the principle? الْمَرْءُ قَادِرٌ بِقُدْرَةِ نَفْسِهِ لَا بِقُدْرَةِ غَيْرِهِ. A person is able with their own ability, not with another's ability, according to Imam Abu Hanifa. And, you don't have to ask someone to assist, even if they would. If you can, it could be good, but I think we may have discussed this before. Not necessarily, because it could cause a lot of hardship to other people. So the ima, if you pray with head movements, the default is you do so sitting when able. So on a hospital bed, for example, you're lying down. If the person can put it into seating position without hardship or harm, then you must. Right? أومأ مستلقيا. But if you cannot do so sitting without hardship, then you pray with head movements, lying down. على قفاه. What's قفا? Yeah, يعني with the back of your neck, meaning lying down, basically. على قفاه, with the back of your neck, literally on the back of your neck. But if your back of the neck's on the ground, where are you going to be? Meaning, so على قفاه literally means on the back of your neck, meaning on your back. Right? أو على جنبه, or on one's right side. والأيمن أفضل من الأيسر, and your right side is better than your left side. ورد به الأثر, and ورد به بالتخير, and this choice, the narrations, there are narrations that have come. والأول وهو الاستلقاء على قفاه أولى, and the first, which is lying on one's back, is better من الجنب الأيمن, than lying on one's right side. إن تيسر بلا مشقة, if it's facilitated without hardship. لحديث فإن لم يستطع فعلى قفاه, if unable, then to pray on one's back. And we explain, qafa is literally back of the neck. لأن التوجه للقبلة فيه أكثر, because then you are facing the qibla more. Because then you are facing the qibla more. Now, there's some discussion about this hadith, right? ولو قدر على القعود مستندا فتركه لم تجز على المختار. If one is able to sit reclining against something, meaning بلا حرج, without hardship, then and one left it, it is not valid according to the chosen opinion. Right? So one could sit reclining against something, then one must do so. And if one left it, it's not valid according to the chosen opinion. Right? And there's a non-chosen opinion that it would be valid. And this is one of the things a lot of people are unaware of. Right? Someone's hospitalized, they're in bed. Right? So they manage to sit up to have lunch, for example. Right? They manage to sit up to get up to go to the toilet, but they pray lying down. There are weaker opinions in the madhab that allow this, and it's important to know the ahkam al-marid, and there's entire treatises written on ahkam al-marid, some of which have been published recently, because people have enough trouble in their regular practice of deen. People get sick, right? One has to be, but those things, it's upon the student of knowledge to work hard a little bit, and what one finds on these things to confirm, right? But there are opinions, especially لغلبة الجهل, right? But you can't just say, I heard that there are opinions that is fine. That's being lax. Okay. Allah. وقدمنا جواز التوجه لما قدر عليه بلا عسر. And we previously mentioned that it is permitted to face the qibla to the extent that one is able without hardship. Meaning, if you're not able to turn towards the qibla yourself, it's excused. If you're able to face it partially, even face it with your head, etc., then وسقوط التوجه إلى القبلة بعذر المرض ونحوه. And that facing the qibla is lifted if one has sickness and the like, such that it'd be an undue hardship to turn towards the Qibla on one's own. Like in the situation where, for example, the hospital, the bed is facing away from the Qibla. Now, if you could make arrangements to help them turn the bed so that you do face the Qibla, for example, or to put you on the side so you can, etc., then you do so. And وَالْمُسْتَلْقِي يَجْعَلُ تَحْتَ رَأْسِهِ وِسَادًا. The one lying down should put, the istihbaban, right? It's recommended that they put under their head a pillow, وِسَادَةً أو نحوها, or the like of it. لِيَصِيرَ وَجْهُهُ إِلَى الْقِبْلَةِ, so that their face is towards the Qibla. لَا إِلَى السَّمَاءِ, not towards the sky. وَلْيَتَمَكَّنْ مِنَ الْإِمَاءِ, and in order for them to be able to pray with head movements. إِذْ حَقِيقَةُ الْإِسْتِلْقَاءِ تَمْنَعُ الْأَصِحَّاءَ عَنِ الْإِمَاءِ فَكَيْفَ بِالْمَرْضَى, because actually lying down prevents healthy people from praying with head movements. Right? If you lie down, try to bend your head a little bit for 3 tasbihs. And then bend your head more for 3 tasbihs requires do you want to try it? Lie down on your back, head down. Right? Now, raise your head and back. Yeah. Right? And more. For 3 tasbihs. Right? And do that for a whole prayer. It's quite an exercise. Right? Qigong uses those kinds of things as like strength training, right? It's like core training and stuff. So it's difficult, let alone healthy people. Okay? So in order to be able to do health training, praying with head movements, you put something behind your back. Let's say even just for comfort level, right? Like most hospital beds are slightly tilted, right? Okay. وينبغي للمريض نصب ركبتيه إن قدر حتى لا يمدها فيمتد برجليه إلى القبلة. And it's proper. ينبغي is used for recommendation. أي يستحب. It's proper that the sick person, meaning if able, raise their knees, if able, such that they don't extend it, i.e. their legs, towards the Qibla. وهو مكروه, and it's disliked للقادر على الامتناع عنه, for the one able to avoid doing so. And this is a slight dislike, not a prohibited dislike, as mentioned by. And Ibn Abdin raises a question about extending one's feet towards the Qibla, that if the reason is ta'zeemul Qibla, then ta'zeem of the Qibla is wajib, would entail be prohibitively disliked. But the mansus in the madhab, it's somewhat disliked. He states it elsewhere in the Hashiyah, that's somewhat disliked. And the argument being that the ta'zeem that's wajib is in the heart. This outward act of stretching your feet towards the Qibla is indicative of lack of ta'zeem in the heart. So there's an outward act. The outward act is not disrespect. Could be ignorance, could be laziness, could be 101 things. Right? So it would be makruh tahriman if there is a sense of disrespect. I don't care if that's the Qibla. That's more severe, right? Maybe some they're lazy. Say, shoot me, I'm lazy. I won't shoot you, but you are lazy, right? وإن تعذر الإيماء برأسه أخرت عنه الصلاة القليلة وهي صلاة يوم وليلة فما دونها اتفاقا أما إن زادت على يوم وليلة فما دام يفهم مضمون الخطاب فإنه يقضيها في رواية. قال في الهداية والمستصفى هو الصحيح، وقد جزم صاحب الهداية مخالفا لها في كتابه التجنيس والمزيد بسقوط القضاء إذا دام عجزه عن الإيماء برأسه أكثر من 5 صلوات، وإن كان يفهم الخطاب، يفهم مضمون الخطاب كالمغمى عليه. وصححه. What do you have? Does anyone have what? Do you have that in your copy? No, in the sharh. Okay. Yeah. Is it in Imdad al-Fattah? Qadi Ghani or Ghina? Yeah, we need to dig this up. Even Dr. Salah, who tends to be quite diligent about these kinds of things, doesn't actually mention this. وصححه قاضي غني وقاضي خان. قال هو الأصح لأن مجرد العقل لا يكفي لتوجه الخطاب. وقال الكمال ومثله أي مثل تصحيح قاضي خان رحمه الله في المحيط، واختاره شيخ الإسلام خواهرزادة وفخر الإسلام السرخسي. انتهى. وقال في الظاهرية هو ظاهر الرواية وعليه الفتوى، كذا في معراج الدراية. وفي الخلاصة هو المختار، وصححه في الينابيع، قال هو الصحيح، كما في التترخانية والبدائع، وجزم به الولوالجي والفتاوى الصغرى. Okay. So here, if one is unable to pray with head movements at all, even by just bending the head as we mentioned, the prayer is delayed for them, means deferred. It remains obligatory, but you're excused from praying it on time. Why? Because there are 3 options to pray: standing, sitting on the ground, head movements. There's no head movements, but you are morally responsible. So, you're responsible for it, but you have an excuse from praying it. This is madhab al-ta'khir, right? It's delayed. Then there are 2 opinions. There's agreement that a small number of prayers, which is a full day and night of prayer or less, is delayed. So one misses 2, 3, 4, 5 prayers, it's excused. Like the delaying it is excusable, but you still remain morally responsible for it. As for if it becomes more than a full days of prayer, then the stricter opinion is, as long as you're able to understand the address around you, then you do need to make it up, even if it lasts more than a day. That's a stricter opinion. And this was what was chosen in the Hidayah of al-Marghinani, and the Mustasfa of, who's the Mustasfa by? Al-Nasafi, Sharh al-Fiqh al-Nafi'. Very beautiful book. The Fiqh al-Nafi' is very beneficial for Samarqandi, but a difference, Samarqandi, Abu al-Qasim al-Samarqandi. Very useful. And the Mustasfa is really, really nice. And it's published. And in the Hidayah, he said this is the Sahih opinion. Because you're morally responsible, you have temporary inability, but you're sane, everything, it's just delayed. And when you're able, you make it up. But the author of the Hidayah disagreed with his own position in his work at Tajnis wal-Mazid, which, and it's significant because that Tajnis wal-Mazid comes after the Hidayah. So if they differ, what's in the Tajnis wal-Mazid is given precedence. That qada is lifted if their incapacity lasts more, the incapacity of praying with head movements lasts more than a day and a night. And this is more expansive. If it lasts more than 5 prayers, even if one can understand address around you, right? So there is not, and this is the same ruling as the one who lost consciousness. Someone who lost consciousness, the mughma alayhi, if the ighma lasts less than a day, the loss of consciousness lasts less than a day, they have an excuse, but they must make up the prayer. It lasts more than a full day of prayer, they're excused. And this is also chosen by Qadi Khan, who said this is the more correct opinion, because intellect alone without physical ability is not sufficient for being morally responsible. Because لَا بُدَّ مِنْ سَلَامَةِ الْآلَاتِ, that you also have to have soundness of ability, soundness of means of fulfilling the command. And Al-Kamal, meaning Ibn al-Humam, said the like of what Qadi Khan said, right? And he said the like of this is found in the Muhit, and was chosen by Shaykh al-Islam Khawahir Zada and by Fakhr al-Islam al-Sarakhsi, great authority. And the Fatawa al-Zahiriyya, one of the major works of Fatawa, he said this is Zahir al-Riwayah. Now that's a claim, right? That's a claim. وَعَلَيْهِ الْفَتْوَى, and this is the fatwa position. Also because it's easier for people. And this is also what's mentioned in Mi'raj al-Diraya of the great commentaries on the Hidayah, and the Khulasa al-Fatawa, that this is the chosen opinion. It was chosen in the Yanabi', which is of the beneficial commentaries on Quduri, by Muhammad ibn Ramadan al-Rumi, who died in the year 616. And it's published both in a poor print edition, and also there's or mediocre print edition. I think they wanted to save on both paper and design and binding. But it's there. And it says in it, and likewise this is chosen in the Tatarkhani, one of the major works of fatwa. And it's also it's somewhat later than the early books of fatwa, so it's a recognized book. And the Bada'i', and Kasani's Bada'i' is brilliant, and it was chosen by al-Walwaliji and the Fatawa al-Sughra. And why is Imam Shurumulali mentioning all this? He doesn't just usually mention this about many other opinions, partly because the other opinions mentioned in the Hidayah, right? People would study the Hidayah. It's also probably because it may have caused a bit of consternation, right? That there's certain things if you say, people would object to, right? And going against the Hidayah, and also given the moral responsibility of prayer, people could object that, but this is the prayer, right? Right? And that's why, and you see Imam Shurumulali himself, there's multiple places where he chooses, when it comes to about matters of validity of prayer, he chooses caution. So here, because they say al-aslu fil ibadat talabu bara'ati dhimma bil yaqeen, right? Or it's a broader asl. Al-asl talabu bara'ati dhimma bil yaqeen. The basis is that you seek to clear your dues with certitude. Particularly in ibadat, insofar as and especially with the prayer, أول ما يسأل عنه العبد يوم القيامة. The first thing, meaning the first outward action after faith that you'll be asked about is the prayer. So that's why he goes into so much support for this, right? Partially. And also because some people may question that. So he's bringing, look at, these are all the places it's found. And also something you would have noticed earlier, like when in many other books that we've been taking, right? Like in the Tuhfa Saniyya, etc. Now, and you see this educational method. And you notice how the Tuhfa Saniyya first half was reasonably easy, and he then progressively escalated the nuance. He's now, so it's sort of like a sneak preview of things that come up in the madhab, right? He's telling us about some of the significant works in the madhab, etc., sort of in passing. وفي شرح الطحاوي, and شرح الطحاوي, and though the published شرح الطحاوي that we have is by al-Jassas. Is there a footnote whose شرح الطحاوي it is? The default when شرح الطحاوي is mentioned is the شرح of al-Isbijabi, which is a more fiqhi شرح on Mukhtasar al-Tahawi. Imam al-Tahawi is one of the, Imam Abu Ja'far al-Tahawi is one of the authors of one of the early great mutun of the madhab. It's edited on its own by the great Hyderabadi alim Abu al-Wafa al-Afghani, who did a number of other important works as well. Just a matan of Mukhtasar al-Tahawi. But like the Mukhtasar of al-Karkhi, which has a sharh, interestingly, by al-Quduri, and it's published, at least in a Risala Jami'iyya. So Sharh al-Tahawi, if it's mentioned unconditionally, especially when it's discussing legal details, it's more likely to be Isbijabi. The Sharh Mukhtasar al-Tahawi of Abu Bakr al-Jassas al-Razi is one of the most brilliant books of istidlal in the Hanafi madhab, as mentioned by Imam Muhammad Zahid al-Kawthari, right? Of legal reasoning. It's brilliant. Of course, Imam al-Tahawi was early, he's well before Imam Quduri, and he himself says, that he considered himself to be at the level of ijtihad, and this is accepted by many who came after. Certainly ijtihad within the madhab, he has his own choices on many things. So the Mukhtasar is very beneficial and great, whatever, but it doesn't necessarily represent the madhab. So وفي شرح القدري لو عجز عن الإيماء وتحريك الرأس سقطت عنه الصلاة. As mentioned in Sharh al-Tahawi, if one is unable to pray with head movements. Right? And you see again here, ima is used for two things, right? One cannot pray by bending and by moving one's head, right? And this is a nuance to notice, right? That what is the haqiqat al-ima? Some understood by awmi, meaning bend. What do you bend? Bend head or bend back? The fatwa is bend head is enough. So you can't pray with bending the back or moving the head. Then you're not responsible to pray. And that's a separate matter, right? Separate matter. In the Hanafi school, one does not pray with the other things, eyes, by bending one's eyes, or one's, raise your eyebrows a little for bowing and a little more for prostration, or you don't perform the prayer in one's heart, because the reasons we'll see. Then Imam Shumbulali says, and this is a broad statement, it's not an absolute principle, that وَالْعِبْرَةُ فِي اخْتِلَافِ التَّرْجِيحِ بِمَا عَلَيْهِ الْأَكْثَرِ. And what counts when there's a difference of opinion about tarjih is what most of the ulama have said. Of the majority, but this is al-akthar min ahl al-tarjih. The majority of the ahl al-tarjih have said. The scholars of who make legal evaluation of positions. Right? It's not akthar al-ulama. So al-akthar la ibra bil-awam. Fiqh is not democratic, that We don't do an opinion poll. What do you think, and what do I think, and what does he think? But even عامة العلماء ليسوا من أهل الترجيح. The commonality of the fuqaha are not أهل الترجيح. What's meant? الأكثر من أهل الترجيح, of the scholars of ترجيح. وهم القائلون بالسقوط هنا. And they're the ones who said that if the inability to pray with head movements lasts beyond a full day, qada is lifted. Rahimahumullahu ta'ala ajma'een. May Allah Most High have mercy on them all. وَأَعَادَ عَلَيْنَا مِنْ بَرَكَاتِهِمْ وَمَدَدِهِمْ. And may Allah return to us from them their blessings and assistance. Right? They say, عند ذكر الصالحين تتنزل الرحمات. When one mentions the righteous, mercy descends. They say one of the best investments you can make, one of the greatest investments you can make, is to send blessings on the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Why? Because it says dua. Angels say, may you have the like of what you asked for. Besides Allah's blessing tenfold and so on. But likewise, when you send, when you make dua for the ulama, right? There are many benefits in it, right? And Imam Nawawi, in his explanation of the Mukhtasar, the Muqaddimah of Sahih Muslim, he mentions that there are things that one can add when reading a text, or even when writing from a text. One, and there's some nuance, but one is honorifics and the other is the dua. So the text says, قال النووي. He says, قال الإمام النووي رحمه الله تعالى. For example, especially when quoting text, sometimes they'll keep it brief, but it's best when reading to do both, or at least make the dua. وَمَنْ عَجَزَ عَنِ الْإِمَاءِ بِرَأْسِهِ لَمْ يُومِئ. And someone who's unable to pray with head movements does not لم يومئ أي لم يصح إماؤه بعينه ولا قلبه ولا حاجبه لأن السجود تعلق بالرأس دون العين والحاجب والقلب فلا ينتقل إلى خلفه كاليد لقوله صلى الله عليه وسلم يصلي المريض قائما فإن لم يستطع فقاعدا وإن لم يستطع فعلى قفاه يومئ إيماء فإن لم يستطع فالله أحق بقبول العذر منه. This text is of uncertain narration, as mentioned by Az-Zayla'i in Nasb al-Raya, right? With this last part is disputed, but similar things have been narrated or practiced by some of the early Muslims. But were there such a clear text, it would have lifted the khilaf between us and the Shafi'is, but there isn't. The last part is disputed. Anyways, so if one is unable to pray with head movements, one does not, i.e. it's not valid to merely move one's eyes or to just intend the movements in one's heart, nor one's eyebrows, because the prostration has been connected with the head, i.e. the prostration for the one unable to prostrate fully has been connected with head movements. That's the haqiqah of ima. Right? Not the eyes or the forehead, the eyes or the eyebrows or the heart, so it does not move to them. لأن الأبدال لا تنصب إلا من قبل الشارع, because substitutes are only established by the lawgiver. The Prophet ﷺ said A or B or C. You cannot make qiyas that D, E or F, right? In something that has been prescribed by the lawgiver, right? And this is not a hukum ma'qulul ma'na, right? The prostration is a حكم تعبدي. So it's not subject to qiyas anyways. Right? Because the Prophet ﷺ said, the sick person prays standing, if unable, then sitting, if they cannot, then on their back, with head movements. And then he quotes the hadith that, and if unable, then Allah is more deserving of their excuse from them. This element is of uncertain establishment from the Prophet ﷺ. وَقَدْ اخْتَلَفُوا فِي مَعْنَى قَوْلِهِ فَاللَّهُ أَحَقُّ بِقَبُولِ الْعُذْرِ مِنْهُ. That then they differed on what is meant by Allah is more deserving of accepting their excuse. فَمِنْهُمْ مَنْ فَسَّرَهُ بِقَبُولِ عُذْرِ التَّأْخِيرِ. Some understood it to be accepting the excuse of delay. فَقَالَ بِلُزُومِ الْقَضَاءِ. So they said that one must make up. وَمِنْهُمْ مَنْ فَسَّرَهُ بِقَبُولِ عُذْرِ الْإِسْقَاطِ. Another said that Allah accepts the excuse of dropping the prayer. فَقَالَ بِعَدَمِ الْقَضَاءِ. So he said what does not need to make qada. وَهُمُ الْأَكْثَرُونَ. And they're the majority, meaning of the scholars of tarjih within the madhab. وَقَدْ عَلِمْتَهُمْ. And we have just described who they are to you. Right? And then he gives us further rulings regarding the sick person. We'll continue from here next week. وَصَلَّى اللَّهُ عَلَى سَيِّدِنَا وَنَبِينَا مُحَمَّدٍ وَعَلَى آلِهِ وَصَحْبِهِ وسلم وَالْحَمْدُ لِلَّهِ رَبِّ الْعَالَمِينَ. Any questions?